The Black Death is, without a doubt, the first event in history that deserves the title pandemic, which, if you're wondering, comes from a combination of the Greek words pan and demos, the latter of which means all people. Between 1347 and 1351, this plague killed anywhere from 40 to 60% of the populations of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And even by today's standards, the mortality of the Black Death was staggering and unprecedented. Higher indeed than the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic, higher than the cholera outbreaks of the 19th century, higher than the current HIV/AIDS pandemic. With the sole exception of the smallpox outbreaks of the New World, which we'll get into in a couple weeks, it was the largest catastrophe to ever befall mankind. What was the Black Death? When and where did it originate? How did it spread, and how was it sustained? What did people try to do to stop it and to cure those infected with it? These are the big questions that we're going to tackle this week. Some of them can be answered with a high degree of certainty. For example, we know that the Black Death was bubonic plague. And we know this because scientists have retrieved and analyzed ancient DNA, or aDNA, from the remains of people buried in London's famed Black Death Cemetery in East Smithfield. The aDNA contains markers for strains of a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, that is, the germ that causes bubonic plague. These strains are practically identical to strains of the bacteria found across the world today. And yes, if you're wondering, in the 21st century, in 2020, people still get the plague. Another thing that we are fairly sure of is that the Black Death originated on the Tibetan Plateau, sometime in the 1200s. Analysis of modern samples of Yersinia pestis have provided an evolutionary history of the bacteria, which appears to have diverged from its ancestor around 3,300 years ago. The place where we see the greatest genetic diversity of Yersinia pestis strains today is the Tibetan Plateau. This also indicates that that is the likely point of origin for the Black Death. Despite our knowledge of these things, there is still so much that remains unclear about the Black Death. Knowing that the disease originated on the Tibetan Plateau, we might ask, how did Yersinia pestis spread across all of Afro-Eurasia in just a few decades? It's not as if people in the 13th and 14th centuries had steam-powered ships or petroleum-fueled airplanes. So, what human factors facilitated the bacteria's spread? Were there certain climatic or environmental developments that contributed to this? What about animal hosts? What role did they play? Here, one of the key breakthroughs of the last decade has been the discovery that rats were not the only carriers of plague. In fact, we now know that several hundred animal species can be infected with plague, not just rodents, but also ruminants, that is, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, deer, etc. Interestingly, the camel was domesticated around the 14th century, just as the plague was spreading out of South and East Asia. Camels served as the major beast of burden for the overland trade routes that connected the Middle East to North Africa. So, might this have been how the Black Death spread here? Of course, this is speculative, and even if it's true, it only gives us part of the story. What about the origins of the Black Death? Here, we can turn to the historical record, for there is a fair amount of textual evidence that allows us to put together a theory for how the plague moved out of Tibet to the rest of Afro-Eurasia. The first thing we need to take note of here is that the 13th century marked the beginnings of the Mongol Empire. In 1205, the Mongols invaded the state of Xia, which is today part of the Chinese province of Gansu. The Xia state was just northeast of the Tibetan Plateau and it was in with the range of the Himalayan marmot, one of the animal species capable of transmitting the plague. Interestingly, Chinese sources record a series of new and deadly epidemics that began during the Mongol conquest of Xia. The first evidence comes from 1211, when the chief minister of the Jin state, governing what is now part of northern China, wrote to his ruler suggesting that he surrender to Genghis Khan. He believed that on account of a disease they were experiencing, the Mongols would not last long in the area, and that as such, surrender was prudent. However, from here it appears the disease spread into the Jin homeland. A physician named Li Gao reported that between 1213 and 1222, a strange new disease struck several Jin cities. Later on, in 1258, the Mongols attacked the Yuan dynasty in Sichuan province. Official records note the presence of a great epidemic that killed great numbers of soldiers in battle. In 1273, China finally fell to the Mongols, and again, here the records speak of a great epidemic arising. Interestingly, these records note that one particular substance, rhubarb, seemed to be pretty effective against the plague. And this is an interesting reference. Rhubarb occupies a special place in traditional Chinese pharmacology. For example, in a Song Dynasty text from 992, it is listed as a treatment for epidemic diseases that produce pea sores. The text also says that pea sores can be white or red, that they are shaped like a pea, obviously, and that they produce raised sores, things that elevate outside of the body and cause the skin to bulge. This is pretty similar to what the symptoms that people with the Black Death produced. So, could these have been the same disease? We'll never know. What we do know is that the Chinese described the disease that accompanied the movements of Mongol forces as epidemic in nature, as something that was new and that resisted usual methods of treatment, and that was connected to military movements and the lifting of sieges. All of this suggests that the Black Death's spread coincided with the expansion of the Mongol state during the 13th and 14th centuries. The fact that the Mongol Empire covered much of Eurasia is important here, because this empire basically functioned as a vast overland trading and communication network that connected peoples of the continent in ways previously unimaginable. All of the human and animal movement the Mongol Empire enabled might have also given disease a way to spread from one end of Afro-Eurasia to the other. As you can see from the map on the screen, two of the geographical regions hit hardest by the plague were the Middle East and Western Europe. How did the peoples of these regions make sense of the disease? How did they cope with it? How did their physicians explain it? And what kinds of remedies did they use to treat it? One of the most interesting attempts to answer these questions came in 1974, when a historian named Michael Doles published a path-breaking essay called The Black Death in Christian and Muslim Societies. We're going to have an opportunity to talk about Doles' essay next time we meet, but before we get to this, I wanted to step back and talk a bit about the kind of history Doles is doing. As you can see from the title of the piece, this is an essay about how two different societies, Christian Europe and Muslim Middle East, dealt with the Black Death. And as you'll see when you read this, Doles is trying to determine the major similarities and differences between these two societies' responses. He is, in other words, doing comparative history. Comparative history is an important subfield within academic history, and in order to make sense of Doles' argument, I think it would help first to have a sense of what comparative history is. So, consider what follows an introduction. What is comparative history? In a sense, all historical scholarship is comparative because history is about interactions between people and cultures, between values, between ecologies and environments. And comparison is one of the key ways that we make sense of these interactions. But as a subfield, comparative history is a very specific thing. At its simplest, we could say that comparative history is nothing more, nothing less than historical investigation that works at multiple sites in order to uncover differences and similarities between them. If we want a more specific definition, we could go with the early 20th century French historian Marc Bloch, who described comparative history as, quote, the process of identifying two or more phenomena that seem analogous and that appear in one or more social settings, and then considering how these phenomena resemble and differ from each other. There's basically two ways to do this. One, we can compare societies widely separated in time, or two, we can compare societies that are historical contemporaries. Among other things, the comparative method can reveal instances of divergent development. That is, when a phenomenon becomes extinct in one place but persists in another. It might sound easy, but there's really nothing simple about comparative history. Because it involves thinking across populations and in-depth study of multiple geographical contexts, it often requires knowledge of different languages and cultures. This is incredibly difficult to do, and because of this, comparative historical work generally takes a long time to produce. Comparative history is also pretty controversial. To be honest, lots of historians are opposed to it. Why is that? I want to give you a few reasons for this. There are four main ones. First, opponents of comparativism argue that this kind of work privileges generalization over specificity, that it favors general patterns over specific variations. They accuse comparativists of painting with very broad brush strokes. Second, opponents argue that comparative histories tend to present the two things being compared as isolated and distinct from each other, when in fact there may be lots of transfers and overlaps and intersections going on. Third, they complain that comparison creates hierarchies, that often one of the things being compared is taken as a standard or a norm against which the other is measured. And lastly, fourth, the last objection is that much comparative scholarship takes the nation-state as the basis for comparison. In so doing, these scholars accept the dubious assumption that national identities are stable and that the nation itself is a natural, preferable political entity. But nations are just one unit of comparison. What else have historians compared? Regions, institutions, cultures, eras, particular events. Comparative histories often look at issues that are common to various cultures, like the family, gender norms, religion, technology, death, and examine the differences and similarities in how they're dealt with. This is kind of tricky because we first need to make sure that the things we're comparing have at least some similarities. Otherwise, comparison wouldn't be possible. If we're trying to figure out, for example, the advantages and disadvantages of various kinds of apples, we need to make sure that the things we're comparing are actually apples, not apples and oranges. But what makes two things similar enough for comparison? Finding appropriate cases for comparison isn't always easy or straightforward. Let's say, for example, I wanted to do a study of trade unions in the 19th century. Should I compare workers' movements in Germany with those of the US? Or would it be better to do a comparison of American and Russian workers' movements? It's not entirely clear. The choice depends on sources, knowledge, the values of the historian in question. Comparison often requires a framework of some kind, a standpoint for recognizing similarities and differences. Okay, we could talk more about this, but that's all the time we have for right now. As we begin this week's discussion, let's start with the following questions, all of which will help set us up for our analysis of Michael Dole's article on the Black Death in Christian, European, and Muslim societies. When you've thought about these questions a bit, please head over to our discussion forum and post your responses. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Bye bye.